Hey, thanks very much, Mandy. Is that okay? Can you hear me? Yeah? So, as Mandy says, this talk's going to be a kind of condensed version of the book that I've got coming out on the struggle for the state in Jordan, the social origins of alliances in the Middle East. Obviously, I'm going to be talking about Jordan, but in a slightly different way, I think, to the way the country's normally approached. I think if there's an overwhelming view, both kind of in academia and mainstream journalism, even kind of popular view, is that Jordan seen as quite a state of very recent origin and a fundamentally stable, if slightly boring one. Sort of a place to which people can flee. So if there's trouble in Syria, Iraq and so on, people end up in Jordan. And as a result, especially, of course, people from here fled to Jordan. The politics of Jordan, the international relations of Jordan, are often seen through the prism of settler colonialism on this side of the river. The question of Jordan being presented as a place to send expelled Palestinians to, the kind of claim that Jordan is Palestine, is often seen as a starting point for discussion of the country and its international relations. So that then leads to another kind of staple of the discussion of Jordan, which is the idea that the main division in Jordanian politics is between people of Palestinian origin and people of East Bank origin, people of Transjordanian origin. And those two groups are then kind of associated with, on the one hand, settled city life for the Palestinians and an imagined, I would say, nomadic Bedouin life for the East Bankers, when actually probably the majority, or at least a very large part of the East Bankers, were always kind of peasants. So none of that stuff's completely untrue. It's not all nonsense, but what I do in the book is take up this issue of Jordan, particularly Jordan's rather dramatic swings in international politics and regional politics in the 1950s, when it looked like immediately after the end of the kind of British rule over Jordan, that Jordan might become actually absorbed into a wider Arab state, become a republic, but then falling back very much to become what it is today, which is a very firm, regarded as the only really firmly stable Western ally in the region. How that came about, and in particular, how that tells us about the way that international relations scholars talk about alliances in the global south, in the third world, especially in the Middle East. And I'm going to present a kind of criticism of the way that is done and suggest that it'd be better to do it with a version of kind of a Marxist theory of uneven and combined development, about how social origins, i.e. certain struggles based on the experience of the embedding of these societies into capitalist relations, result in certain trajectories of their international alliances. So that's kind of overview of the argument. If I was doing this in Britain, I would probably start off with the theory that I'm talking about. But here I think I'll go with the kind of history that I talk about. So particularly, I focus in on the 50s in Jordan, and a few specific decisions and events that were made by the Jordanian government. In brief, they were the decision not to join the Baghdad Pact in 1955-6, which was a lot of pressure on Jordan, on King Hussein, to join the Baghdad Pact. The expulsion of the British officers who ran the Jordanian army, particularly under a famous man called Glub Pasha, in March of 1956. The attitude of Jordan towards the Suez War, which is quite complicated and contradictory, and then a final series of events that are really all connected together, when Jordan, first of all, looked like it was going to turn towards an Egyptian alliance, basically, to take money from Egypt and Saudi Arabia to annul the Anglo-Jordanian Treaty, which is not just a treaty between nations, but actually part of the Jordanian state, as I'll explain in a minute. But then, moving away from that and going back to becoming very strongly kind of ally of the United States under the so-called Eisenhower Doctrine in 1957. So it's quite a short period of time. But what was going on at this time in the region generally was, I mean, it's familiar. It was the end of the imperial system, Britain's basically imperial domination with some French influence in the Middle East. And Jordan wasn't that dissimilar to a lot of other states, particularly the ex-British mandate states, Iraq or Egypt, in that it was only semi-independent after the Second World War. So when Jordan became independent in 1948, there was still really a large part of the Jordanian state was run by Britain, and probably for Britain. So as in Egypt, where there was control over the Suez Canal zone, in Jordan you had a subsidy, and this is very important. I'm going to go back and talk about how important this is later. Subsidy going to the Jordanian state, to the Jordanian army in particular, from Britain, but directly controlled by the British commanding officer of the Jordanian armed forces, which was John Glubb. So in the early 50s, Jordan wasn't really an independent state, and it was suffering the same kind of struggles as the other Mandate-era political structures had with the events of the Nakba, with their failure to defeat the kind of settler colony becoming a state of the State of Israel in 1948, which had repercussions across the Arab world. So the rise of the free officers in Egypt, quite clearly to do with that. In a delayed sense, the eventual fall of the Iraqi monarchy is also to do with that. And Jordan experienced the same kind of pressures, but with the added problem for the Jordanian government that, of course, it was the main frontline state with Israel. So both a very vulnerable, very quite weak, small state with not a lot of natural resources, and also the largest land border with the State of Israel and the largest number of Palestinian refugees. Also, this area itself was part of Jordan, so right up until that road over there. So we are, in fact, at the site of a battle between the between the Arab Legion and the Israeli forces, or the Zionist forces, in 1948, literally outside this door. So, in Jordan itself, in the 1950s, after the accession to power of the very young King Hussein, who his grandfather had been assassinated again here, not too far away. I think it was at Jaffa Gate. I'm not sure exactly where he was assassinated. He was assassinated in Jerusalem. Yeah, it was inside Al-Aqsa. Yeah, at the entrance to Al-Aqsa. Because of basically the collaboration with Israel in 48. And he was, incidentally, it's been said, coming to meet Reuben Shiloh, who was the guy who founded Mossad. So he wasn't actually just coming to pray in Jerusalem. He was coming to speak to Israel. So he was assassinated. His son, Talal, came to power. Talal was mentally ill, or at least declared mentally ill, deposed from the throne. And his son, Hussein, at a very young age, became the king. So this is all in 1953. But at this point, there was a kind of, as in other Arab states, a rising movement on the left and of Arab nationalists. So varying kind of degrees. At the kind of rightward end of it, you had some notable big families like the Nabulsis, who were very connected to this kind of strand of saying we want to have a more independent-minded Jordan and a fairer, more equal Jordan. And at the other end, there was the Communist Party, which was very small but had some influence, and maybe in between people like the Baathists, who were present in Jordan as well. And also a group within the army called the Jordanian, this is disputed how strongly it existed or not, but the Jordanian Free Officers, so people who were aspiring to do what the Free Officers had done in Egypt, and kick out the British, and particularly for them, Arabize the army, which became a big issue. So kick out the British officers who prevented Arab officers from reaching the higher parts of the command. So that became a really big mass movement, actually, this side of things. And it's often assumed that that was fundamentally Palestinian, that the Jordanian national movement left, basically, were based in the Palestinian, around here, and the Palestinian towns in Nablus, and that they were settled people as opposed to the Bedouins. There's some truth to that, but actually, if you look at the people, the main kind of areas of strength of demonstrations for the Jordanian national movement, it's very often in East Bank towns. So in Amman, but also in Salt. Salt was a massive area of strength for the Jordanian national movement. Even in places like Kerak, which is now very, very conservative. Kerak, which if you don't know, is a town kind of in the middle, central south of Jordan. It's a very conservative town now. It had something like 300 members of the Communist Party in the 1950s. So there was a genuine kind of movement within Jordan. So what happened with these alliances, and how are they connected to this social struggle? So let's talk about the first one, the Baghdad Pact. If you're not aware of this, the Baghdad Pact was an attempt by the Iraqi Hashemites, so the people who, the kings of Iraq and the kings of Jordan are the same family, Hashemites. The kings of Iraq to bring about a kind of NATO-style alliance in the Middle East, directed against the Soviet Union. Particularly Iraq and Turkey were trying to kind of do this. That's why it's called the Baghdad Pact. And they really needed a frontline state, i.e. a state that had a border with the Zionist entity, with the State of Israel, to come on board with the Baghdad Pact to give it legitimacy. And the obvious one was Jordan, because it's under British control, essentially. So King Hussein and his advisors came under massive pressure in 1955 from Glob and from the British diplomats, from the Iraqi government, particularly from Nouri Said, famous figure, kind of Machiavellian figure in the Iraqi Hashemite history, really trying to force Jordan to join the Baghdad Pact. And kind of Jordanian politicians who were largely, old school people from the same families that had been associated with the royal house since they came to rule Jordan in the 1920s, kind of saying, well, we might join the Baghdad Pact, but you should give us some more money, basically, and then being denied money, and then this kind of argument at the top. But what changed it was that there was basically, it's still to this day, known as an intifada in Jordan, in the winter of 1955, where first the Turkish kind of military attaché delegate came to visit Amman, and then a British guy called General Templar. It's not really important who he was, but he was obviously trying to pressurize Jordan into joining the Baghdad Pact. At the same time, the Syrian military representative came to Amman, basically to say no to this. This sparked off huge demonstrations throughout the whole country. I mean, to the extent that people were being shot, like something like 10 to 15 people were killed by the armed forces, which at this time were under the control of British officers. There were 3 cabinets that collapsed. The cabinet ministers started going out in the streets, demonstrating with the demonstrators. And if you read the kind of British Foreign Office documents of the time, they're absolutely paralysed with fear that Egypt's going to take over the country. They're really scared of Egyptian influence. So basically the government couldn't sign the Baghdad Pact because it couldn't find anybody willing to do it. So by the early part of 1956, that scheme was kind of off the table. So what looked like Jordan doing what you would expect, right, it's very close to Britain, dependent upon Britain for its income, basically, it doesn't do at that point. And the reason that it doesn't do it is that there's this huge kind of social struggle going on. This fed over into changing the fundamental nature of the Jordanian state when King Hussein, as I say, very young, kind of looking to legitimize himself, sees this big wave of Arab nationalist and left-wing agitation against the Baghdad Pact, decided to take on Glob Pasha. So the guy who was running, the British guy who was running the Jordanian army. And in March of 1956, he dismissed him, basically, quite summarily, said, you're not running the army anymore, replaced him with somebody else, a guy called Ali Abu Nawar, and replaced all the British officers, actually. So removed them, which caused the British to go pretty berserk, because they correctly perceived that Glubb was their influence on Jordan, and that was how they could have this sort of card to play in the Middle East. So if he's removed, that they would be in trouble. Not only that, but if you remove the British officers from the Jordanian army, it means that there's not really a lot of point to the Anglo-Jordanian Treaty, which is about having British officers in the Jordanian army and British bases in the country, and for which Britain is kind of paying Jordan. So this is obviously setting things up for a crisis. But the Jordanian people were ecstatic with this decision. And the same people had had this kind of intifada in the late autumn or 1955 came out again on the streets and were enormously boosted King Hussein's popularity. So he became very, very popular in response to this sort of nationalist and left-wing kind of movement, anti-colonial movement in the Jordanian national movement. So that's the second time where you see this rather weak figure, if you look at the cards he's got to play, Hussein, apparently shifting away from his patron, his colonial patron, shifting towards this anti-colonial movement. And this was part of a process that was interlinked with the increasing tensions in the region as a whole, especially in 1956. So tensions over what was eventually to become the nationalisation of the Suez Canal, which was also to do with the Israeli raids, counter raids in some cases, over into Egyptian territory, basically. Not just into Gaza, but especially the raids that were going on from Israel to here. So you may have heard of the raid at Kibya, which was a West Bank village, obviously then under Jordanian control. A young Ariel Sharon cut his teeth in 1956 by executing about 10 or 15 Palestinians, people who were Jordanian citizens, in 1956. So there was a huge, the same people who were demonstrating for the dismissal of Glubb against the Baghdad Pact were also demonstrating against and putting a lot of pressure on the government to take the fight to Israel, because the hostilities hadn't really ceased. So there was still this constant back and forth kind of raids going on, especially in 1956, which reached a kind of weird peak with the Suez War, which Jordan actually stayed out of. And it's curious to see why Hussein in particular was able to stay out of the war. And the reason has to do with Jordan's only, or at least its freest, election, which happened in the autumn of 1956. Up until that point, you had elections in Jordan, but basically they were rigged. I mean, the state used the army to elect this kind of puppet parliament. But in response to the movement that had emerged in the early 1950s, Hussein actually permitted a genuine election. And to not really anybody's surprise, the political expression of the Jordanian national movement, something called the Jordanian National Front, which consisted of the Jordanian Socialist Party, the Baathists, and the Communists, although they were under different names, swept the board. So they became the government. They were the leader of this movement, although he wasn't an MP, a guy called Suleiman al-Nabulsi, was asked to form cabinet. So for the first time, there was actually democratic control over the decision-making of Jordan's government and its foreign policy. This is the reason why, actually, there was a battle over whether to join the fight with Nasser against Britain, which would have been a big problem because Britain was still paying for Jordan's government, basically. So Hussein, really quite astutely, became very, very pro-Nasser. So he phoned Nasser when the Suez Canal was nationalised. He made public statements saying, "We welcome this, act of Arabism. We are ready. Jordan stands ready to fight." And Nabulsi said nothing. Nabulsi didn't mobilise any troops. They didn't do any kind of movement towards the Green Line. They didn't do anything. And the Syrians, and in fact the Egyptians, were actually happy for that to happen because they thought, probably correctly, that Jordan would lose. So they were quite happy for this nationalist government to do nothing. But Hussein used it as an opportunity to shame the nationalists, basically. So as part of this internal struggle, there was a rather odd response to this to the Suez crisis. But this was delaying a contradiction, or delaying a crisis that really came to a head around the end of 1956 and the start of 1957. So as I said, there was a treaty called the Anglo-Jordanian Treaty, which arranged for this subsidy to be paid for Jordan, and basically for Jordan's foreign policy to be more or less controlled by the UK. The Nablus government decided to annul it. So they say, we're not going to have this treaty anymore. And actually, the British didn't care that much because they didn't have Glove there anymore, so they didn't see it as a big change. But the government of King Hussein, did see it as a big problem, because it was about people building up an independent power base, and it went along with things like, for example, legalizing the Communist Party, starting to make Nabulsi starting to make noises about Jordan becoming part of a wider Arab Republic, which was very much a popular scheme at the time, that Egypt, Syria, eventually Iraq, part of the one united Arab Republic. And also the arrangement, which was never finalized, to take a replacement amount of money from Egypt and Saudi Arabia, something called the Arab Solidarity Pact. So this it started to lead to a divergence between the royal house and the cabinet. So they started, for example, dismissing people from important positions, dismiss some from the army or the home office, and then reinstating them. So Hussein would sack someone, the cabinet would send them back to their job, Hussein would sack them again. Basically, the government wasn't functioning. There were two different principles behind it, which was always going to come to a head. And it did in April of 1957, which essentially was pushed forward by the replacement of British power with US power. So Britain, obviously having basically been ridiculed in the Suez incident, was not the force that had once been in the region. And it was kind of replaced by the US. The first act of the US was to declare something called the Eisenhower Doctrine, which was the idea that the US would support countries in the Middle East that were at risk of falling to communism, which usually meant Arab nationalism, actually. And this is quite aimed at Jordan. So there was a dispute about this in the spring of 1957, and a kind of, if not mini civil war, clashes within the army, where some people claim there was planned to be a coup against the king. Others claimed that, in fact, the king mounted a coup against the Nabulsi government. At any rate, there were about 2 to 3 weeks of constant upheaval, this kind of, again, uprising in Jordan in the spring of 1957. Almost a kind of separate parallel government was established in Nablus, which rejected the authority of governments appointed by Hussein, until Hussein, at the end of April, managed to bring together a lot of his supporters, particularly from the army, mainly people from particular tribes, so people from groups such as the Bani Sakhar and the Hoitat, who I'll speak about later, who went through Amman at night, kind of clearing the place out, repressing people. It was a very violent kind of repression of the movement that had threatened Hussein. So he won out internally, and therefore was able to go back to the Americans and say, I'll come over to your side if you replace the British money, which they did. And basically, ever since then, that's been the way that Jordan works. So that, if you like, is the history that I talk about, or the kind of focus of the history that I talk about. But what's that got to do with a bigger question? So as you'll notice, there's quite a lot of dramatic swings in what Jordan was doing at this point. And Jordan, not only in this period, but at later times as well, is taken as a really good example of how states in the Arab world, or in the Third World more generally, are seen in international relations literature as they're not really proper states, basically. So they're, unlike it's assumed in the West, where there's a national interest that governments express and which they behave in international relations to pursue. So the British government has at its heart the interest of all British citizens in security, and so it pursues alliances to make them secure. That's the idea. That in the third world, or the global south, let's say, and especially in the Middle East, that these are regime states. They don't have a basis in their society. So when they make international alliances in their foreign policy, they're doing it to support the regime against internal enemies. So, or external enemies at the same time. So the idea is that there's this divorce between the state and the society, that this third world states or Arab states they're not up to scratch in some way, they're deficient. They haven't reached a point of integrative unity that would allow them to behave properly. So I think there's a lot of problems with that. It's fairly obviously kind of quite Eurocentric, teleological and so on, but its most basic logical problem is that it kind of explains something that does happen, so very quick and violent changes of international allegiance in the Middle East by something that isn't there. So it's saying there is something lacking and therefore something is happening. It's like looking for something that you don't know is there, basically. Or it's explaining a presence by an absence, which isn't really working. Like, how would you know that it isn't the absence of something else that produces this behavior? So what I'm saying is that as a case study, using Jordan, you should look instead at tangible evidence of how these states are embedded in their societies in a different way, and resulting from their different stages of or the point at which they're integrated into a global system of capitalism and sovereign states. But nonetheless, it's something that you can say is tangible, is there, and that you can identify as the origin of their behavior in international relations. And in particular, I use kind of concept from Marxism called uneven and combined development, which again in Britain I might spend longer on, but here I'll zip through since it might not be of that much interest. But basically the idea being that there are patterned changes in the way that societies operate over time. If you look at the way, for example, pretty much any society in our world today operates, people go to work, they get paid wages, they go and buy bread, they go and pay rent, and so on. It's different to the way that, for example, the Mongol Empire of the 10th century operated, where people had to give up tribute to somebody who was stronger than them. It's a patently different set of social relationships. And those change over time, but they don't necessarily change over in a linear way, in a singular way from point A to point B. And they don't always change in the way that you have all the change at one time, followed, or it's all one way, all the social relationships work in one particular fashion, and then they completely change in every possible manner to something completely different. In other words, you get different forms of social relationship combined with others. It's uneven and combined development. And in particular, in Jordan, I would say that if you have to look at the way that in the Ottoman period and in the early British Mandate period, the type of social relationships, you could, if we're going to call it this, basically the type of economy changed and was replaced with a relationship with Britain, which then becomes the basis of support for the king, the basis of the fact that the Jordanian army, unlike the Syrian army, unlike the Iraqi army, is not really a site of big class differences or big class struggles. It's actually quite cohesive actor. And there's a reason for that, I'm going to say, in this uneven and combined development of Jordan. How much time have we got? Okay. Specifically, this area, Palestine, but further south and east into Transjordan, was obviously part of the Ottoman Empire until the early 20th century. And the Ottoman Empire was what I'm going to describe as a tributary mode of production. What that means is that instead of a society in which the economic part of life and the coercive part of life are formally separated. So, for example, when I go to work at the university, it's not, well, sometimes it feels this way, but it's not because there's somebody standing at the end of the bed with a sword saying, go and work at the university, teach these kids. It's because, you're paid a wage, which you require in order to survive. So that means that the compulsion to produce a surplus is not apparently done by force. It's done by economic means. There's a separation between economics and force. That is not visible in most other kinds of societies, particularly in a tributary society where the direct producers, so basically the people who grow stuff or the people who keep animals, have to give their surplus a specific amount, which it was under the Ottoman Empire, something called the usher, the tenth. It wasn't always a tenth, but a tithe to somebody who could take it from them by force. And that's what I would say is the tributary mode of production. Now, there's a big debate that perhaps we can get onto, or perhaps not, about whether feudalism and tributary societies are the same. I think they're versions of the same kind of thing. And the reason for that is that if you have this, if you think about the way that companies compete with each other, Sony and Toshiba compete with each other to be more efficient. They want to use labor more efficiently. However, if you are in this tributary situation and you are lower down the food chain from the Sultan, you're getting the tithes from the peasants and sending it to the Sultan or the Emperor or whoever. Your interest isn't in being more efficient, it's in carving out more space to get more tithes, to take more from the peasants. And especially if you're aided by things like mountains, rivers, topographies that prevent the central agents coming to take from you what you've taken from the direct producers. So basically, I argue that in the tributary mode of production, there's always a tendency to kind of dissipate, to lose power as you get further from the centre and as you get into more difficult terrain. And that the tribe, as it's known, which is this kind of mystical or fetishized notion about the Arab East, the tribesman on his camel kind of idea, which runs very strongly through a lot of discussion of Jordan. The tribe is actually such an economic unit. It's a version of this, where direct producers are exploited by coercive power. And the tribe is a way of organizing who's going to do that and who's going to get their surplus. And it's done through a myth of patrilineal kinship, or what's known as agnatic kinship. So like my grandfather's grandfather, whatever, which isn't true. I mean, most of the time people turn up and say, I want to join the tribe, and they can join the tribe. It's a political ideology. But it's quite an important one, because there are two terms that are really important for understanding the economy of pre-mandate Jordan. One is Hawa, and the other one is Masha. So Hawa is the tribute taken by mobile tribes, the Bedouin, basically, from settled communities and from people passing through their territories, which is quite easy for them to do because they're mobile and armed. So they're in the top position that allows them to exploit direct producers more easily. Masha is a collective form of managing agriculture. So it's not quite private property, but it means that everyone in the community, usually a settled village. So as I said, the east bank of the Jordan was never completely nomadic. So there's always been a continuum between agriculture and pastoralism. Masha is a way of splitting things up slightly more equally, so that when they come to pay give their surplus over to the Bedouin, or potentially to the state, each family bears a roughly equal burden. So those were the two ways that the economy was basically managed in the absence of a really strong central state in what became Transjordan. But something happened in the 19th century, which was that the Ottoman Empire, which was based upon this kind of system throughout its domains, started to lose out, started to lose its predominance to England. What am I saying England for? Britain and France. So countries that had some kind of industrial revolution, bourgeois revolution, whatever you call it. Especially beginning to lose the most productive provinces of the empire. So the Bulgarian areas, the kind of Balkans, the places that had much more rain, much more, produced much more, they began to be either independent or taken over by European powers, including the more productive and kind of developed Arab areas or North African areas, Algeria taken by France, Egypt taken by Britain. So in order to kind of catch up and defend itself against the imperialists, the Ottoman Empire tried to sort of impose reforms that it thought, or the policymakers at that time, the Ottoman diplomats at that time, thought would encourage the kind of society they thought Britain and France were. In particular, these are separated by about 30 years, but introducing some reforms into making people liable for paying tax personally, so not through a community, not as a tithe, but as an individual person, and registering their land. So that obviously those two things go together, because if you are going to pay tax individually, you have to own land individually, which is quite different to those things that I just spoke about, Hawa and Masha. Different forms of social relationship. And in order to make that work, the Ottomans tried to kind of break the power of the tribes in what became Transjordan. And they sort of semi-succeeded, but not fully. And it's interesting how this halfway outcome, the result of this kind of halfway outcome between the Ottomans and the tribes of that area, because it led to a situation where quite often the tribal chiefs registered the land. So that's happened in Syria, that happened in Iraq, and where it happened in those places, you saw huge differences in, huge class differences basically, particularly in Iraq, where you have like 1% of the population owns 55% of the land by the mid-20th century. That didn't happen in Jordan. And one of the reasons that it didn't happen is that this kind of halfway house was reached between the Ottomans and the Bedouins, which allowed them to register the land, but get it worked by somebody else. So the Bedouins themselves, the tribespeople themselves, didn't split into kind of different, into labourers and landowners. Instead, everyone could still go off and look after their camels at certain times, but gain the produce from particularly people from Palestine, in fact, right from around here, from Egypt, and even from Sudan. If you go to the Ghor, if you go to the Jordan Valley, you'll find people there really look African. They came from African roots to go and serve these kind of plantations. So the labour relationship was exported away from the tribe. And this was the situation that was in place when the British turned up. When they turned up after the Ottoman Empire collapsed after the First World War, nobody was ruling Jordan at all. It was all quite independent little statelets. And they weren't that interested in Jordan as such, but they wanted it because it's positioned between Palestine. Originally it was the same mandate. They split it into two in 1922. But between Palestine and Iraq. And particularly they wanted things like oil pipelines to go to Haifa. And they couldn't do that if people were going around raiding things all the time. It wasn't secure. So they had this constant struggle with the still quite strong groups, Bedouin groups, to secure the borders. And throughout the 1920s, if you read the British documents, they're obsessed with this, particularly because the Saudi Wahhabi groups, the Ikhwan, not the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, but the Ikhwan of Saudi Arabia, were coming and raiding Jordanian Bedouin, who would then raid back, and it was very destructive. And this was because, in the tradition of Hawa, what you do to make up your losses is you go and take it from somewhere else. It's not like a kind of capitalist competitive system. So the British were at a loss as to what to do with this situation, and they were quite obsessed with unruly tribespeople, and this image of the unruly tribesmen. And at first they tried force, not very often because it was expensive, but it didn't really work. Thankfully for the British, somebody turned up from Iraq called Glub Pasha. He arrived with an idea from Iraq, just at the time when the Bedouin were kind of undergoing an economic crisis, where there was a drought, their camels were dying, were being replaced by mechanized means of transport. And they couldn't, given that these borders were in place and this kind of generalized security was in place, they couldn't go and replace their losses by raiding somebody else. So their old means of life was gone. He replaced that directly and consciously with British money. So went around all of these tribes, the Bani Sakhar, Bedouin, the Hoitat, right down in the south, and gave the chief £800 or £1,000 or however much money, which then went down to their lower tribespeople, and that became the army. That basically became the army in Jordan. So from that point on, the bedrock of the Jordanian state was this kind of combination of people whose old tributary mode of production had been replaced not by this horizontal labour-capital relation, but by this direct dependence upon a British subsidy. And that's why, I've been told to shut up, so we'll have to talk about it in a bit, but that's why when you get to the 1950s, when people who are basically the same kind of class groups as you get behind Arab nationalism everywhere, so on the one hand, a small workers' movement, pretty small in Jordan, but civil servants, teachers, some army officers, but these kind of groups which wanted what they perceived as nationalist modernity, come up against, as you find in other places, an army, which is an arm of the state. But they don't find an echo, or as large an echo, inside the army. They don't find a support base in the way that they did in Iraq, or in Syria, or in Egypt. And that's because there was this subsidy which had cemented these relationships. Not because the Bedouin are, inherently loyal, or Orientals, or, untouched innocents, but because of this material relationship. So I think I'll leave it there since I've run out of time.